Well, the big question is how, right? Because, I mean, as an architect, you can influence a site, but you can't influence a street, you can't influence a town. The frustration is there is no coming together with local authorities, bigger picture. I mean, Argent have done an extremely good job in terms of a very difficult location and site, and it's taken them 20 odd years, and now it's deemed to be a success. But you know, they have strived for a long time, going nowhere, I suspect, with the different interested parties. So the big question is how.
One of our projects that we delivered over the last few years, which did take 10 years to deliver, it could have been delivered in 5, was a place called Rushton Lakes, and it's on an edge of town as opposed to town centre. But the reason I mention it, the public engagement, the work that everybody, the project team, the client, the developers, but also the local authority from chief exec down, bought into the whole concept of creating somewhere really unique and special that responded to the place it was in. And it's in a SSSI, Ramsar designated area where one really shouldn't have been doing these things, but we had 30 acres of brownfield sites. The result of that, over a long period of time, and the consultation and the buy-in and canvassing of not just the local people to get their response, but the work that the private and the public sector did together over that period was absolutely inspiring. And yes, we were implicit in all of that, but most importantly, the joy that people feel when they go there, the way you see people reacting to the spaces and the place that we've created, which simply responds to this beautiful lake and the setting. It's on the edge of a town. Everything that's come about it has brought economic positivity, so much so that it's bringing £60 million worth of revenue to the town of Rushton annually, created 2,500 jobs, and is a great example, so much so the Crown Estate bought it and now manage it, which is delightful, having spent 10 years of hard graft making it happen. So as an example of what can be done given the grit and determination and passion of a fantastic team of people, but most importantly, a very visionary client who frankly had the balls not just the money, to commit to make it happen, pull the right team of people together, get the buy-in of the local authority, and from chief exec down to planner and back up again, so that we could deliver this fantastic thing.
And didn't you get 20 minutes on Countryfile?
Yeah, it did have a 20-minute feature on Countryfile on a Sunday night, which was a bit extraordinary. Didn't expect that for a leisure retail development, but very special.
So maybe the answer is you can, but you have to go a bit slowly. Ojay?
Wow, what a question. That has to be the first question, seriously. I mean...
Set the bar high.
How? Yeah, I know. So how? It's exactly the question, actually, my organisation was formed to try and answer. So the Association of Town and City Management recognised that actually when it comes to town centres and city centres, you have numerous different stakeholders with numerous different interests. And amongst them, not one of those stakeholders, unless you're talking about a particularly unusual area where you might have a single landowner, what you'll find is for all of those stakeholders, nobody really owns a town centre. And so the challenge of being able to bring forward sort of large-scale schemes which have a single vision, which fit a single master plan or whatever it might be, is really challenging because of the buy-in you need. You think about it, landowners, local authorities. When I say local authorities, don't use that in the singular. Different elements of local authorities might have different ideas of what they want from their town centre. Transport operators, businesses, believe me, the business occupiers and the property owners sometimes want very different things in terms of a vision going forward. Residents, visitors, the list goes on and on and on. And so the work of creating and fostering those public-private partnerships in town centres that can bring together a single voice that can get things done is what is what we try to work on every day. And it's difficult because in some areas it is a challenge. You cannot get everybody around the table to agree on one single route forward. And I see these different models as well, and people championing. It feels almost like they're sort of two different ends of the spectrum. One where people look for strong leadership that can push through the right change, and others where it's a more partnership-based consent approach to redesigning a town centre and looking for change. Are there any easy answers? No, not necessarily. Not for many places, not unless you have that one single landowner or somebody that's ploughing in a lot of money, or you have, as some local authorities are starting to do, plough money into their town centres to buy up various bits of strategic property so they can manage it all under one roof. But for most areas where you have fragmented ownership, it continues to be a challenge, and it's one of the biggest barriers to positive change, I think, in many town centres.
I've worked on a couple of projects in India, and the frustration with those projects was that they were singular object buildings in an disarrayed urban landscape. And I was asking the developer and one of the local authority officials, why can't you organise the infrastructure like the Chinese do? They seem to just sort it all out. He said, well, we're a democracy. And I thought that was a very poignant position, which says that you need good governance to develop great places, not dictatorships. And things that were being said earlier, I think, around motivating stakeholders, getting people to work together, is so important. And actually taking the opportunities that are out there. And, for example, events. I mean, East London, the Olympics, massive event. My God, have we grabbed it with both hands and regenerated an entire bit of London. And that's happened in other cities too, in smaller, even my hometown, in Home City in Coventry. They regenerated and managed to get money set aside for other things into the urban landscape by saying, oh, the Olympics are coming, we need to look good. I mean, seriously. And they then redid a number of squares and spaces, improved the link from the railway station. These things can happen when you've got inventive politicians that can grab what it is they've got and use it to empower the city and bring those very important people who vote for them, let's not forget it, with them to make the thing work.
A lot of what's being talked about is just endemic, this incapability of getting anything done because no one can be drawn to consensus. And I find it all the time. And it is really interesting how people move quicker when they are offered a carrot, and often that carrot has to be money. But I think that if there is... It doesn't just have to be money, actually, and that's something that I learned with the work that we did with the Thames Estuary Commission, which is to say, how do you develop work and existing ideas of local communities? So a kind of bottom-up approach and a top-down approach. So how do you think about what exists and join the dots? I think if we can join the dots, and that is about collaboration, but that's also about understanding what exists as good ideas already. You'll always find in local communities that they are already doing things off their own backs. Yeah, that will make a huge difference, but they'll only make a huge difference if somehow you can join them with a bit of money, and it doesn't have to be huge money, be seed funding. So what we did with the Thames Estuary is to say, okay, give us 100 ideas of the things that you want. They could be existing, they might be massive big projects, small big projects. We sifted them down, we chose 15, and then we said, this is a very simple way of doing 2 years of work, and then we said, what can you do immediately? What can you fund, or in this respect, not necessarily fund, but help kind of get off the ground? What's the low-hanging fruit, if you like? So what can we deliver in the next 2 years? What are those three things that will make a difference if we help and assist to do that? And then the same again for 10 years, and then the same again for 15 to 20 years. How do we make things deliverable? Well, you make things deliverable by pulling the small things, the achievable things that you can do by a little bit of love and attention, but you do that within a much bigger framework, so that everybody knows where they fit together. And that needs strong leadership, that needs good governance, and that needs somebody to say, if you collaborate, if you get all this right, we're willing to give you some investment. And if you don't, then we're going to take it away and do it for you. And that's pretty much actually what we did with the Oxford Milton Keynes Cambridge work that we did with the NIC. And it was surprising how quickly everybody got round the table, because in the end it's the national interest. We have to make our city centres work, we have to make our town centres work, and people have to, local authorities have to understand that, some will be in the short term perhaps winners, some will be losers, but actually combined together we are, we're all working for a kind of the bigger picture politics, if that makes sense.
Michael.
Just a very small point, which is agreeing with everything that's been said. The thing I would add as a direct answer to the question is stories and narrative. I spent 7 years chairing something called the Thames Gateway from 2000 to 2007, and one of the lessons of that was that if you're genuinely going to harness the creativity of the individual and the small players with the institutional power of the big players, you need some kind of convening power. And with the Gateway, it took almost 5-6 years to get people to imagine that London might look east rather than look purely to the centre and the iconic landmarks of Westminster and so on. The stories they convene people in an imagination, they convene people in a way of thinking about their future. So they can be powerful, but they also need time. Because without those stories, it takes 10, 20 years to get the Olympics. It takes 10, 20 years to get Stratford. It took 10, 15 years to get Excel. They do take time.
My original question was going to be, how can design be used to stop large retail companies moving away from the high street, moving to industrial parks or online? But actually, from listening to you all and the Twitter poll, do we actually need those large retail units, and can design be used to provide a space for social encounters instead of actually just going to large businesses to shop?
One little example of that, which we're working on, we're based down near Southampton in Hampshire, and working with Southampton City Council on regeneration projects, looking for opportunities to regenerate those large retail stores that are no longer in use. So there's a very dated, or of its time, shopping centre called the Marlins, which has never quite worked in the city. Most cities have got one, most towns have got one. And we're revisioning a large section of that to a co-working space, which obviously London has dozens of, Southampton doesn't. And the council has been inspired to invest a few £1 million in creating this new co-working office, inspiring young people to come and work, holding on to the graduates that are leaving the universities, so that we're providing a space, very flexible, multi-use space, for them to come and gather, meet, and it's all in a big shop, effectively. Use of retail space that simply is not going to be let to any of the major groups, whether John and I and the rest of us want them there or not. They're not going to be taking that space on going forwards. That's just one example.
Is that working?
It opens next month.
Okay.
The response and engagement with it has been fantastic from a community and a business point of view. And most importantly, so far, both interest from the public and private sectors in every respect, just a real engagement with it, which, Southampton is a little bit behind the curve, maybe, but it's great they're doing it. Fantastic use of space that otherwise would have sat there redundant for another 10 years.
Yeah, Ojay.
Right, I'm going to come out and say it. So, isn't it a bit liberating for designers and architects if actually some of those larger retailers are actually moving out and freeing up some of that space in our traditional urban centres. Because for a lot of the big retailers, I won't name any names, some of the big supermarkets maybe, a lot of their space they are looking for, have always looked for, have always wanted, are just the big identikit sheds which look the same all over the country. And actually saying the role of retail in town centres is changing, it's going to change. Maybe we don't need to toe that party line anymore and try and get these big whopping great sheds in the middle of our historic town centres. Maybe we can actually be a little bit liberated to do something which is more in keeping with the history of that particular town centre, more in keeping with the heritage of that town centre. Maybe it's an opportunity just to do something a little different in every area which suits the local community a lot more, rather than meeting the needs of some big global behemoth which is just going to plant its big grey shed in the middle of your high street. Just saying.
John is dying to go.
No, I just wanted to say I was fortunate to collaborate quite often with Jan Gell on a number of projects, and Jan wrote a great book, Space Between Buildings, which is legend, follows on from the great North American train ride. And the whole notion of the space between buildings now, I think, is dead. Controversial. Why I say that is actually the Nolly plan, the tabula rasa, no longer sits between buildings, because I think the ground floor is now a complete everything in the city. You just move through more and more through buildings. I mean, interesting, I was in Sydney just before Christmas, and the idea of having to check in through a building and give your card and give your name and all the rest of it doesn't exist. Security is still a problem, I know that here, but the notion of coming into buildings and having a coffee and it's actually the front door to a big bank, that's where we're changing. So ground floors are no longer defined by the streets anymore, in my view. I think streets are going to go through buildings. Around is no longer the case. So these big changes in big boxes, I think you're absolutely right, they're going. And I think place is inside as well as out.
Great. Sadie?
Just to go back to the question, I think the answer is until we all stop shopping at Sainsbury's local and Tesco's local and kind of places where most people know that they can get what they need at a price that they can afford. Maybe that's Lidl now, Aldi. That actually the answer is no. I think that we are creatures of habit, and when big developers make, when they start regeneration, I think they're always looking to if it's Argent, it's Waitrose, but if it's, it's kind of, who is it that's going to, be the, I can't think of the word.
Anchor tenant, is it?
Yes, exactly,
Yeah.
And I think we have a way to go before we dismiss the facts that, that the big supermarket chains aren't going to somehow exist. I mean, they're adapting and changing. They aren't in the big. They're moving smaller. They're becoming smaller. They're becoming local, and there's. I think that they're not. They're big beasts that aren't going to go away quietly or quickly. So I would suggest that isn't going to happen very soon.
I'm actually involved with sort of letting retail space, so sort of on the other end of that question. And in the sort of food sector, there certainly is, people will continue to shop in supermarkets, we certainly feel. But in terms of big box fashion and national retailers, they are fleeing from the high street. And the problem is that they are the people who pay the rents that make the developments possible. So how do we fund all this regeneration without any tenants who are going to pay rents for it?
Good question. Do you want to go?
Yeah, that'll be Ben. Obviously, it's an enormous challenge. We sit with the likes of the Crown Estate who bought Rushton, and I sit there with the likes of this gentleman and say, okay, so we've got a 55,000 square foot Next or Primark or whatever it is. We need to change it into a climbing wall, or we need to change it into a trampoline, thing, or whatever it might be. Well, that's a big challenge. The rentals and our letting friends in the industry have got a big challenge to completely rethink how we redistribute the cost and return and the overall rental basis on these spaces, because I completely align with John. A lot of those large units on the high streets, not necessarily the supermarkets, the food stores, but the Primarks and others of the world, all of them, there'll be a street through the middle of it. It'll be open public space. It'll be interactive space. And a lot of the retailers are going to have to be far more reactive and atmospheric and respond to us wanting an experience when we go shopping, rather than just simply going and look at a load of racks with stuff on it. So it doesn't necessarily answer the question, because I think we've all got to work together to advise the investors, the asset managers, effectively, who look after the high street. They're under a great deal of pressure and challenge. They all know that leisure in some form is going to take over big chunks of space, and that leisure can be public realm and space, as well as it can be other types and uses. How they get that rental revenue, we all know there's got to be a check on that. It's not realistic to carry on the way we've been going. It's a broken process and system, and we've got to fix it.
Okay, Ojay.
Someone had to bring up the question of money, didn't they? Someone always brings it into the conversation, and you know what? It's a fair question. It's a very fair question, and it's not just rent; it's rates as well. How do you fund development, regeneration? And I guess one of my, I know the importance of things like community and making sure there is a space for community in our town centres, and things like experience and the need for retailers to look at experience and experience-led economy to make sure they keep people interested. But the counter argument to that always is, and it is a fair question, how do you make these things pay? How do you make certain schemes viable? If, say, within the four walls of a retailer, we are not thinking about selling stuff but creating an experience, realistically, I mean, retailers are struggling enough as it is. Realistically, if we're talking about them having less space for selling, does that make their lives any easier in terms of having a viable space which they can actually afford when it comes to paying the rents, the rates, the staff costs and whatever else? In terms of community space, ultimately the tax system we have, that's still going to attract business rates. In terms of the costs, in terms of viability, in terms of some of the stuff we would like to see come forward, we do probably need to rethink the financial model. I'm not sure there's any way around that. It's a really good question, and I have no answers.
Michael.
I think we've got to get to the nub of this, that part of the financial question is about how we see the functional workings of those spaces that you're talking about. Because if we think through the language of the spaces alone, in terms of their function, logically it doesn't work and town centres evacuate. But most straightforwardly, there's a mix of residential and commercial uses that can be changed. And footfall and density link to the point I was trying to make about mobility, how people get to these places to create the footfall that is there. And I mean, it's not a direct answer or the whole answer, but part of the answer to the question is, if you look at Barking Town Centre, you look at Woolwich Town Centre, places that are deserts become less than deserts when there are people in them, using them, actually living there as well as using the space, so that footfall changes, density changes, and then the demand changes as well. And so I think there's part of the answer about retail is weirdly about residential.
So maybe part of the answer is looking differently at the question.
Each question has actually got a bit closer to where I'm coming from. My architectural practice works in a northern city, which is a heritage city, and it's got all of these problems. It's starting to build a new shopping centre, which it's getting very, very worried about, and is changing its plan to try and find new uses. But what I don't hear is the discussion about what's happening to the rest of the town. I'm not going to tell you where it is. It's a walled city. It's got a beautiful new theatre, which is bringing culture, which is a lot of what our answer has to be. But then we've got these great behemoths of British home stores sitting there empty. And what worries me is the kind of scale of those spaces, whether they will actually allow money to come in by way of a bit of residential, and whether there isn't a role for trying somehow to get the major players, the Debenhams, the BHSs, to actually sit round the table and say, how can we work with this particular town where we've been deserted? We're not going to find a future in the same way, but they need to collaborate. I feel, is there an answer there? Is there a way we can get the major players to sit round the table and work with local authorities and urban designers to come up with new master plans?
My hometown, if I have one, is Beverley in East Yorkshire. And whilst Beverley's still a beautiful place, and it's very like Winchester, where I now live just outside, Beverley has had a retail development done in recent times, which is somewhat detached and distracting from the core town centre and market square. And whilst all the publicity said one links with the other, and it really has, no, it doesn't. And that's because, in my opinion, the whole team, developer included, is not encouraged sufficiently, or indeed made sufficiently, to engage with the whole historic fabric of that place. And whether it's a walled city or it's a beautiful small town in the and by the way, Beverley, Harrogate, Winchester in the south, and a number of other places, it's the same wealth, it's the same people driving around in Bentleys and Range Rovers. There's no difference, actually, even in property prices. So it's not lack of wealth, it's not lack of availability for those developers and investors and asset managers to recoup their investments. It has to be driven both politically and publicly by, dare I say, us all standing up and saying, this needs a different approach. It's got to be reinvented. The stuff that Ojay was just, we have got no answer. That's why we're here, and that's why we're doing what we're doing with REBA Journal and the team. It's very exciting to actually be talking about this in an open forum, and more input like you've just given is vital to us guiding that route down the right path.
Okay, we're coming towards the end. So, John.
Just very quickly, that's Chester. I know Chester quite well, and it's just like so many historical cities. You don't want to lay flat that which is your biggest asset, yet you want to densify it because that would help footfall and breathe more life. So you've got to work with what you've got. But just to give you a little bit of a positivity about it all, I actually think the retail strategically is changing dramatically anyway. I think we're going for the more bespoke, the more personal, the more unique. So we're all after those things that are not in the high street that you get every day from your M&S, I don't think. Younger people are looking for things that are just for them, the special. So printing, you'll be printing your own stuff quite soon. And you'll be going to that shop to pick it up because that's where the printer is. Or you'll have your own printer, but that's by the by. But I think there's a dramatic change in the way that we are looking at things that we want, because we can buy anything on your computer from anywhere, but we can't get that special thing that is unique to us, that we might have designed or might have chosen, or we might have seen that was just made locally. And those things that Chester has to offer is exactly that type of urban landscape in which that can thrive. And I think a lot of historical cities will be picking up on this. So off the back of their obvious, tourism issue, which is obviously making a lot of money for Chester and cities are like that, there will be this bespokeness, which I think will add to that.
Okay, so that we don't leave feeling that you've been sitting in an echo chamber and we're just talking to each other. Just going to ask the panel, anyone who wants to, for like a really quick fire, one thing that you might do when you leave this room, or one suggestion to all of us when we leave this room of something we just might do differently. I'll go first if you like. So the thing that I'm thinking is that a small change can make a big difference. I think otherwise you can get a bit overwhelmed, and some of the questions, like the first gentleman's question, it's like, eating an elephant. You just don't even know where to begin. Whereas if you start with one toenail and put it in a different place, it does make a difference. And I say that, I worked on the Olympic Park for 7 years, and sometimes it did feel quite overwhelming. I was working for the ODA, and then, it doesn't really matter, whatever. Lots and lots of stuff, integrating arts and culture with design, construction, engineering, and it often felt quite overwhelming. But one of the things was trying to do small things, particularly small things after games, when everyone's going, oh, so what's going to happen now? It's all going to be awful, there's going to be no legacy, blah, blah, blah. And you could get very overwhelmed. So we would try to do something tiny, and then someone would go, oh, I see. Oh, well, can we have 10 more of those? And then, we quite like that. Any suggestions?
Well, I'll very quickly say, look at the local culture, identity, and brand of the place in which you are working, and find yourself in it. Work with those wonderful things that you've got there.
Be in the brand, be in that car.
And not be afraid of thoroughness. So back to the very first question and the things that we've discussed, most of these processes do take time. We've got to be patient, I'm afraid. I haven't got any of that, obviously, but I'm hoping everybody can go away with thinking about that, how we approach it, and getting the public engagement with these processes that we're all talking about, so that we're actually designing things and delivering things that have some legs and flexibility for the future.
Anyone else?
I would just say, you act for today, but you never forget your grandchildren.
That's
There
nice.
is a sense that the classical principle was that you leave the city a better place when you depart than when you arrive. And I think there's something about that ethic that's quite important.
Lovely.
Oh, I don't want to say anything after that. That's really nice. My strapline's always been, we're greater than the sum of our parts, and it picks up on what most people have been saying, which is that if we work together, we're stronger. And I'd also say that ideas don't cost money.
That's nice. Ojay?
I think I would say the next time I'm on a panel and we're all giving our grand schemes for how we transform and make town centres a better place, I think my recommendation next time is we just duck the question from the guy that asked, so how are you going to do that? Because that is a really difficult one to answer. So next time, sorry sir, but I'm not answering your question because I have no answer.
Okay, look, thank you. Thank you for your attention. I know it's the end of the day. Thank you for being here. Thank you to Reba and Akko, and thank you to my fantastic panel. Thanks a lot. Cheers.